Turning our attention to Ephesians chapter 5, I'd like for you to read with me, beginning in verse 15, please. Ephesians chapter 5, verse 15. See that you walk circumspectly, not as fools, but as wise, redeeming the time, because the days are evil. Therefore, do not be unwise, but understand what the will of the Lord is. I think there's something to notice in this passage that is very significant. When he says, therefore, do not be unwise, but understand what the will of the Lord is. The idea of not be unwise, but understand, those are synonymous things. As Paul does in other passages, he will state a negative, then he'll state the same thing positively. And that's what he does here. When he says, don't be unwise, but understanding what the will of the Lord is. When he says, but understanding what the will of the Lord is, that's what he's saying is how you be wise. And so to be wise is synonymous with understanding the will of the Lord. And so if we're going to make the choice to do the wise thing, then that wise thing is going to be understanding the will of the Lord and aligning our lives with that wisdom from God of understanding His will. And so you see those terms that are synonymous here. I'm also intrigued by something else in the background of this book. Ephesus itself was a place that had all kinds of corruption because of idolatry. The goddess Diana was there, which was said to have at that time been the eighth wonder of the world. It was a city of refuge, named by Rome that way. And as in the Old Testament times, when the Lord made cities of refuge, if you stay within a bow shot of the city, then you could not be prosecuted for anything. And so therefore you had all kinds of sensuality, all kinds of greed, all kinds of every sort of sin you want to brand it, however you want to describe it, that was there in Ephesus. It was not a morally neutral environment. It was a very morally polluted environment. And evidently, there are some Ephesians, because he's writing to Christians here, who are struggling with that. Maybe they're facing the idea of blending back in, of mixing the world with their walk with God. You see some things that indicate that throughout the book. I'm not sure it's absolute, but I think you see some indicators that are there. And so because of that, because you see the blurring of those lines that are there, Paul then gives these words. He will say again, see that you walk circumspectly. Well, how do you walk carefully? As wise, redeeming the time because the days are evil. Here the days are evil. These are the evil days in Ephesus that I just described. Therefore, do not be unwise, but understand what the will of the Lord is. And so his exhortation to them is, we need to be wise, and that therefore produces the question, what is the wise thing to do? It's true, the question itself is not there, but the thought that comes from that, be understanding what the will of the Lord is, be not unwise. The positive way to say that is be wise. Therefore, produces the question, what is the wise thing to do? What do we do that is consistent with understanding the will of the Lord? Because we, like people in Ephesus, do not live in a morally neutral environment. We don't have to go looking for trouble. Trouble of every brand, pride, sensuality, greed, immorality, worldliness of every kind is on every street corner, on every billboard. It runs across the advertisements of whatever device that we're viewing. We don't have to go looking for it. It is right there in our face. And if we're not careful, we, like the Ephesians, can become so comfortable in our environment that we begin to blur the lines. Not because out of any premeditated thing, but just simply because we don't walk wisely, because we don't walk carefully, because we don't live consistent with understanding what the will of the Lord is. And so we too need this exhortation that Paul gives. There's something else that impresses me about this. When we read these words in 16 and 17, they come across as a command. Do not be unwise, but understanding what the will of the Lord is. And if there were exclamation marks in the Greek language, that's about how it would have been said. Don't be fools, be wise. And you had exclamation mark after each one of those exhortations. But how can you command someone to understand something they don't know? How can you command someone to study something they don't know and therefore reach a conclusion because they don't know? So there's got to be something more than just simply the fact he's giving a command when they don't understand what he's talking about. I think what he's saying is this. When he says, do not be unwise, but understanding what the will of the Lord is, I think what he's saying is, listen, you know the right thing to do. I don't have to explain it to you. Everything I'm talking about in this book, you know the right thing to do. Therefore, be wise and do the right thing. I think that's what he's telling them here. And so when he tells them that, it then brings to mind what they know because they know the right thing. He's not expecting them to understand something they don't know. He's expecting them to live consistent with what they do know when he says be understanding of what the will of the Lord is. But you know, until that fact, until those facts are things that are right before us or that slap us in the face because we know we're not doing the right thing, then we mentally and emotionally and spiritually will not make those wise decisions. I mean, how many times has it been the case when someone has a health scare, maybe with their heart, and they said, I didn't know it was going to be that serious. I would have taken it more serious. Mickey Mantle, for those who are of my generation, who was the Babe Ruth of my generation for the New York Yankees, back when the New York Yankees were really the New York Yankees, that Lloyd and I really love. Mickey Mantle said, if I'd known I was going to live this long, I'd have taken better care of myself. That's this. He had a health scare because of his drinking and immoral life that finally got his attention. There's going to be something along the way that's going to slap us down, and it's going to get our attention. And that's what Paul is trying to help them see here. And so when we think about what it means to do the wise thing, I think we need then to have 3 points of reference when we think about that. And the reason for that is this. If everything is drifting along slowly and almost imperceptibly, then we don't realize, unless we have a fixed point, that we are drifting to. I mean, if you're on the water and it is just slowly drifting, it's not torrential, it's just slowly drifting along, unless you have a fixed point on the shore, we don't realize how far down on the river or in the lake away from the shore we have drifted. And so therefore, we are swallowed up. There's an old saying that says, rising water lifts all tides, but it also swallows you up. And so we need something that is a fixed point, or some things that are fixed points that will help us in discerning what is the wise thing to do so we can be consistent in understanding the will of the Lord in our lives. And so there are 3 fixed points I want us to look at, and they'll make some applications briefly at the end. The first is, from my experiences, that is, what is the wise thing to do in light of my experiences? In light of my experiences. So obviously, we're looking at something we've experienced, something in the past. In fact, in this very book, Paul will address something like that. Look back at chapter 2. Chapter 2. Look at verse 1. And you he made alive who are dead in trespasses and sins, in which you once walked according to the course of this world, according to the prince of the power of the air, the spirit that now works in disobedience, among whom we also once conducted ourselves in the lust of our flesh, fulfilling the desires of the flesh and of the mind, and were by nature children of wrath, just as others. Do you see what he's doing? He's focusing on what they were. Look in chapter 4. Look in chapter 4. He says, verse 17, this I say therefore, and testify in the Lord, that you should no longer walk as the rest of the Gentiles walk in the futility of their mind, having their understanding darkened, being alienated from the life of God because of the ignorance that is in them, because of the blindness of their heart, who being past feeling have given themselves over to lewdness, to work all uncleanness with greediness, but you have not so learned Christ. He references what they were and reminds them of that and said, in view of our past experiences, in light of that, what is the wise thing to do? Yes, Paul will say in the book of Philippians, forgetting the things that are behind, I press on. And so it's kind of a double entendre, a double-edged sword, if you will, rather. On one side, you forget. On the other side, we need to remember. There's one side that we need to remember our past experiences, so it helps us make the wise choice today. But those past experiences should not become the driving influences in our life. They just serve as signposts. They serve as markers in our life by which we can measure, are we doing the wise thing? Are we living with understanding the will of the Lord? The fact of the matter is, if we've lived any period of length of time at all, our past experiences are indelibly imprinted upon who we are. We're never going to walk away from our past experiences. They are there, and they have contributed to making us who we are today. And so in view of those past experiences then, what's the wise thing to do? In view of those past experiences, what is the wise thing to do in a marital relationship? In view of past experiences, what's the wise thing to do in handling my finances? Relationally, and past experiences, what's the wise thing to do? You see, based on our past experiences, it may be there are activities that, others can engage in that I can't engage in. It may be there are places others can go that I can't go. It might be that there are people who pardon me, I was trying to walk through it and it wouldn't go. Matt, Rick, thank you. For some reason, I just got stuck here. It might be there are some people others can be around that I can't be around. Why? Because of past experiences. Those past experiences then have everything to do with helping me make a decision about how to walk wise and walk understanding the will of the Lord. How many times have people in their past experiences, thanks Rick, come to the conclusion the wise thing for them to do, thanks buddy, is to cut off the internet? How many times have people based on past experiences made the decision the wise thing for them to do is get rid of this phone and go back to a flip phone? Why do people make those kinds of decisions? In Matthew chapter 18, listen to the Lord about the importance of something in our life that needs to be cut off. Matthew chapter 18. Notice what he will say in verse 8. If your hand or foot causes you to sin, cut it off and cast it from you. It's better for you to enter into life lame or maimed, rather than having 2 hands or 2 feet to be cast into everlasting fire. And if your eye causes you to sin, pluck it out, cast it from you. It's better for you to enter into life with 1 eye, rather than having 2 eyes to be cast into hellfire. Why would you take such severe action? Because based on past experiences, it's the wise thing to do. Based on past experiences, if I'm going to live understanding the will of the Lord, then I'm going to have to empty myself, rid myself of those things that cause me to stumble. You see, in light of our past experiences, which make the sum total of who we are, what's the wise thing to do? A second signpost that I think is important. And that is, what is the wise thing to do in view of my current circumstances? George Santana said, those who do not remember their past are likely to repeat it. The book of Ricky says, those who do not recognize what caused them to sin in the first place are bound to repeat it. In view of our circumstances, what's the wise thing to do? I don't know about you, but when I've got myself in trouble the most, it's been because I reacted rashly to something. For example, it may have been just a response because I was stirred, and so therefore there was a word that was said, and the way it was said. There was an email that was sent, and the way it was sent. There was a text that was made, and the way the text was written, and the way it was sent. And then no sooner do you hit the send key, or no sooner than you utter those words in anger out of your mouth, you say, oh man, I wish I hadn't have done that. I wish I could do that all over again. But the circumstances that were there, those present circumstances, the wise thing to do was not done. How would it been the best thing to do when anger is stirred? To do nothing. Maybe the first response to whatever the stimuli is that stirs us that way is to say or to do nothing and let it settle down. How many problems that exist relationally between people would be solved if we just gave each other time to settle down? Here are the circumstances, and I'm stirred in that moment. But the best thing I can do is say nothing at this time. Why? Because based on my past experiences, I can see how rashly I respond in present circumstances to things that have stirred me that way. And so I've learned in present circumstances, the wise thing to do regarding my circumstances is nothing. You see, life has its ebb and flows. Life is not one consistent shot straight up. Life has its ebb and flows. And about the time we enter one age bracket, we think we've got the problem solved. We just enter another age bracket and it presents a whole new set of problems for us. And because life ebbs and flows, maybe the decision I made that was wise today would not be the wise decision tomorrow. Because tomorrow's another day and the circumstances are different. So I have to ask myself, in light of our circumstances, what's the wise thing to do? In light of the ebb and flow of life, in light of the ebb and flow of my own disposition, what's the wise thing to do in my relationships? What's the wise thing to do in this world? What's the wise thing to do with regard to finances? What's the wise thing to do to understand the will of the Lord? To demonstrate that. In light of our present circumstances, how am I going to live consistently, redeeming the time with understanding the Lord? And that brings us to a third signpost, and that is our future hopes and dreams. Do you have a mental picture of your future hopes and dreams? If you have that mental picture, is it a mental picture that's just general? Or does that mental picture also have some specifics in how to accomplish those hopes and dreams? Just my observation about myself, I would say probably those dreams, hopes and dreams are much more general at this time as opposed to specific. But I would ask you, in 10 years, if you have a mental picture financially of where you want to be in 10 years, what's that mental picture? Do you have specifics about that? Or is it just a mental picture? The general picture. In view of your relationships with people, maybe your marriage or your children, where do you want to be in 10 years? Let me reverse this just a moment. Back up 10 years. Can you go back 10 years and remember the mental picture you had of your hopes and dreams 10 years ago? So now then we're 10 years today, advanced. Where are those hopes and dreams today? Probably along the way, those hopes and dreams changed. For example, if we think about hopes and dreams, do we think that Adam and Eve ever dreamed of living outside the garden? But their hopes and their dreams changed. You see, we rob ourselves if we don't think about today in view of tomorrow. Parents with children at home try to teach their children, especially when they begin to reach that college age or that age in which they're contemplating marriage, try to get their children to look to the future to validate or measure their hopes and dreams today. If you go to this school, get this degree, what's that going to look like? If you marry this person today, what's it going to look like? If I look at my marriage today and say, what are the hopes and dreams for my marriage? It's not that there are marriage problems or not marriage problems. Is that what do I let those marriage problems do to my marriage? Do I keep repeating the same marriage problems? Keep having the same marriage problems year after year after year? Then as Santana said in the book of Ricky said, then you're doomed to repeat the same mistakes and have the same results. And so therefore, in view of our hopes and dreams with our children, 10 years from now, some of you are going to have children, some of you are going to have empty nests just like me and Jody. 10 years from now, probably Jody and I are going to have great-grandchildren. But right now, you have those children at home. What are you doing today at home with those children to nurture that relationship with them so that when they are removed from the home, that relationship only grows and deepens? What are your hopes and dreams for that relationship? Now, yes, we have to acknowledge this. Somewhere along the way, things happen. Those mental dreams that we had 10 years ago, those mental dreams we may have for 10 years, life happens and it gets in the way, and there are decisions beyond our control that are made. And sometimes those decisions are costly. And we look then at those hopes and dreams and we say, why did I have those hopes and dreams? Look, I have been crushed by those hopes and dreams. For most of us, that's not the case. But for some, it is. How then do I plan hopes and dreams 10 years from now? Because the hopes and dreams I had 10 years ago have now changed and have been crushed. So in light of our hopes and dreams, what's the wise thing to do? Now, if hopes and dreams have been crushed, or if your hopes and dreams have fallen in line with what your hopes and dreams are, there's one commonality. What's the wise thing to do tomorrow? both have to ask the question still. I can't change that. What's the wise thing to do tomorrow? And what can I do today to help affect those hopes and dreams tomorrow? Because you see, when we help our children make those decisions about their hopes and dreams, we're validating their lives today. So what's the wise thing to do in view of my hopes and dreams? Now let's just apply this a little bit. I ask financially. So financially, from the past, knowing where you are at the present and where you want to be in the future, what are you going to have to do financially to be there? If you're single today, and your hope and dream is in 10 years to be married, then what are you going to have to change today? What are you going to have to do today? What will be different about you in 10 years so that you can have those hopes and dreams? Now, yes, if you're single, there's another component to that. It takes another person. But what can you do in that? In my marriage today, if I want to live with her for another 10 years, then what am I going to have to put guard against? What am I going to have to put aside? What am I going to have to do? If I want the relationship with my children, like I said a moment ago, what am I going to have to nurture? What am I going to have to build? So they will call me so I can call them. Or so that when I'm old and I need their help, they will come help me. Let's put some skin and bones on that just a moment. Let's put some flesh and muscle on those bones just a moment. Let's look at it negatively, first of all. How would asking the wise thing to do have changed the course of the world if David had just asked, what's the wise thing to do here? Now, you know, David had nothing in his past that would have indicated that he would have any proclivity to have fallen for a woman like Bathsheba, seeing her in her naked state. But he could have asked the question in the present circumstances, what's the wise thing to do here? Is the wise thing to do, as king, I have the power to pursue her, or is the wise thing to do here is to flee? How would it have changed the course of the world for Uriah if David asked, what's the wise thing to do? How would it have changed the course of his family, of his own house, if David had asked, what's the wise thing to do? Murder in his own family, by his own children, insurrection by his own son. David's life is never at peace after that moment, after that foolish choice, that unwise choice with Bathsheba. Let's take another. What about that man about the parable with the rich fool? Very successful farmer. But he says to himself, I'm going to build bigger barns, and then says, take thine ease, eat, drink, and be merry. What would have been the wise thing to do? He had hopes and dreams because he's building bigger barns. He's not living status quo. He's got a mental picture of where he wants his hopes and dreams to be. But in view of his hopes and dreams, what's the unwise thing that he does? What's the foolish thing that he does? He sits down and says, take thine ease, eat, drink, and be merry. What if he had made the wise choice and said, in view of how God has prospered me and enabled me to build these barns, then I'm going to take what I have and I'm going to use for good in his kingdom. There's going to be this guy named Saul of Tarsus, it's going to be Paul, and he's going to have some help, and he can have my number so he can text me and let me know when he needs help. How would the kingdom have been advanced and helped by that man? It would just been the wise thing to do. But let's turn it around. Let's look at that positively just a moment. Don't you think that on that day, when those people ask, what must we do to be saved? and Peter told them and they followed through, don't you think that day they said that was the wisest thing to do? Would you not agree, given our past and where we were in our present, our mental hopes and dreams for the future, the wisest thing that any of us who have been accountable to God have ever done was what they have done? I've never heard anybody say, I've seen people walk away, but I've never heard anybody say, you know, that's the most foolish thing I ever did. Do you think Joseph, even though it landed him in prison, got there and reflected upon the fact, you know, in that circumstance, why did I run? I mean, look at where I'm at now. Running from her was the most foolish thing I could ever do. Is that what he said? He would have said, how can I do this thing and sin against God? That's the wisest decision I could have made. And look at how it affected my hopes and dreams for the future. Do we think that day he was thrown in the pit, he had that mental picture in his mind to say, you know, one day I'm going to rise out of the pit and I'm going to sit next to Pharaoh on his throne. He's going to turn the whole kingdom over me to feed people. No. Joseph, like most young people, probably had no hope and dream beyond yet just passing the living today. But when he got there and his brothers came, do you think for a moment he said, you know, I just didn't live understanding what the will of the Lord was here? No, we know. He said it was the wisest thing I could do. When Saul of Tarsus is head set going into Damascus to persecute Christians, and he is struck blind, and he goes and lives in a place till Ananias comes and teaches him, he is baptized and the shackles fall from his eyes. Even in view of everything he says in chapter 11 of 2 Corinthians, it happens. When he's playing the part of the fool, all those things that happen there that are terrible and tragic. All those perils here, perils there, perils everywhere. Perils everywhere he woke up, there was a peril. Sometimes whipped and left for dead. Do you think for one moment he ever looked back at the past and said, that was a foolish thing to do? Now we know he had mental hopes and dreams because he was on the fast track to be the president of the Sanhedrin. And he says, I was the Hebrew of Hebrew and Pharisee of Pharisee, which meant there was nobody in my class that excelled me. I was top of the class. And then he says, now I'm like one born out of due season. But it's the wisest decision I ever made because he called me to be an apostle. You see, not everything is looked at from the standpoint of failure. Sometimes we look at these wise decisions from the standpoint of what is success. And we can look at our past and see not just our failures that have impacted us, we can look at our past and see how our successes like our past have also gone to make us who we are. And we can know in this moment, we can be strong because we've been strong in the past. And we know in this moment we can have hopes and dreams even though today some of them have not happened. Even though today some have not happened like we hoped and dreamed, there's always tomorrow that the Lord has. And who knows what the Lord will provide and the Lord will bring for us tomorrow. But if I look at the next 10 years through the disasters and the disappointments of today, that's not the wise thing to do. Because then I'm dooming my present and my past. Because my hopes and my future, my dreams for my hopes and dreams for my future had the prospect of being brighter and greater than what my disappointments have been today. I don't know how, but I know who can make it happen. You see, when we look at ourselves in every area of our lives that we've talked about, there's but one question to ask. What's the wise thing to do? Because he said, redeeming the time, not as unwise, but understanding what the will of the Lord is. Now here it is. This isn't for you. This is for me. I have to ask this. You have to ask this. Brad Waltz will tell you the wisest thing he ever did was 30 years ago, consistent with my and Jody's anniversary, is marry Elena. Because Elena didn't think she'd still be here. The wisest thing that ever happened were the doctors that she found. Don't we have those moments? Don't we have those things in our lives that are that way? He's saying, don't be foolish. Be wise. And remember to ask yourself, what's the wise thing to do? In view of my past, in view of my present circumstances, in view of my hopes and dreams for the future. Did you know the Lord died so we could have hopes and dreams of the future? And when Satan caused that, it may have looked like the most foolish thing the Lord ever planned, is to have his son die on a cross. Look at him now. He's crying, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? And nobody's coming. Look at what a fool he is. And then he arose. And then he ascended. And we have seen what men call foolish, the wisdom of God. It was the wisest thing he could ever do, to offer to me and you hopes and dreams for the future eternally. And those hopes and dreams for the future eternally came because he's the Christ, and he's called us to change our mind about God and to come to him and be baptized and have our sins washed away. And when you arise, you will say, that's the wisest thing I could ever do. So now's the time. Don't be foolish. Don't be unwise. But understand what the will of the Lord is, because he calls you home. While we stand and while we sing.